The concept of character in an individual is determined by a multitude of things. Webster Dictionary states that character is the culmination of a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The actions you take every day determine your character, and we know this. But what does it mean for an entity to have character? Does an entity's character abide by the same rules that an individual's character does? Is an entity's character something that is time-bound? Can it change? With all this in mind, I would like to pose today's thesis. Do we judge the character of the United States of America on its principles or its history? I do think that my personal struggle with this dynamic has led me to this question. As a small child, I was told to be patriotic by doing things such as saying the Pledge of Allegiance and participating in the rendition of patriotic songs. I didn't think that I had any feelings toward what I was doing at the time. However, looking back on it, I did feel the need to be patriotic by supporting my country and to be proud of where I was raised. I think the first time I felt conflict with these feelings was in my US history class in 7th grade. Here, I learned of some things that the United States were responsible for that made me question so many feelings I had related toward my perception of the United States of America. I was always aware that the United States had things in their history that were morally reprehensible, but for whatever reason, in 7th grade, it hit me in a very different way than it had in the past. A couple months ago, I was scrolling YouTube when I found an interesting video from Fox News. The topic of this video was a poll that found that patriotism was an attribute that more and more Americans than ever did not find to be important. The reasoning given for this in the video was that there were two prevailing narratives in the United States. One was that the United States was founded on eternally great principles, and the story of America is one in which we try to fulfill those principles to the fullest. The second narrative is one that looks at the history of the United States and takes into account all the good and all the bad in order to judge the character of the nation and whether or not we should be proud of it. After watching this video, I realized that this was the internal struggle that I'd been facing for so many years. So I tasked myself with exploring this topic further and trying to reach a verdict. I think that I had to set some rules when trying to look at this in an objective way. The first being that I had to look at this on a purely historical basis. My reasoning given for this is that we don't know the outcome of current events, and therefore we have no way to judge them. There's too much differing opinions on current events in order to accurately judge the nation as a whole. The second thing I had to do was to define the term principle and to pick which values to use as examples. And honestly, this was the hardest part. What is a principle and what is just an idea? Which principles were the ones that founded America? How far back should we look for America's values? I think a founding principle is an idea that can be considered to be at the heart of the United States of America. Ideas may have been present around the time of the founding of the United States of America, but are not founding principles that can be seen at the heart of the nation. These values can be found anywhere from the creation of the Magna Carta to the ratification of the Constitution, which in its preamble states a goal of coming together to form a more perfect union. If it is something that can be considered a critical and important value to the United States, it is up for interpretation and discussion. So the first two principles I want to look at are E pluribus unum, the motto of the United States that stands for out of many, one, and all men are created equal. I think anyone with a moral compass can agree that these are two very great principles for the United States to have. I also believe that these can be traced back to the beginning of the nation. Now to start, there have been times in our history in which our actions have aligned with these principles. For example, America has very seldom been a homogeneous nation. America is seen as a melting pot, and I would say that this is a fair assessment. Furthermore, the idea of being created equal is one in which America has sought to fulfill, first by abolishing slavery, then by giving African American suffrage, then by giving women suffrage. We've been slowly progressing to fulfilling our principles. And this is great. But more often than not in American history, we go against our principles. We were founded on the principle of E pluribus unum, but in multiple instances in US history, we have restricted immigration in a pretty racist way, banning Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants, but also holding Japanese people as prisoners after Pearl Harbor. We were founded on the principle of all men are created equal, but there's still a wage gap to this day in the United States, and racial profiling in law enforcement is still a huge problem. However, many could just see these things as America slowly working toward its principles and the story of American fulfillment. I would then say that the real question is, has there been points in our history in which our actions have strayed so far from our principles that what we stood for was outweighed by our actions? How far do our principles take us until we are forced to reject the notion that having great principles is all that we are judged on? E pluribus unum is great. But when we force Native Americans off their lands and let thousands of them die on the Trail of Tears, or force their assimilation in the Carlisle School for Native Americans, did we really stand for a heterogeneous society? The American Revolution was fought for independence, for a country to govern themselves. But then why did we deny others that same right during the imperialistic era of the United States, or when we fought regime change wars that destabilized the Middle East? Is American imperialism antithetical to our principles of democracy and liberty? Do we not stand for freedom, or do others not have the same rights? If that is the case, what does that say about our principle that all men are created equal? How can we say that we stand for that principle when even to this day there are clear violations of this? How long can we say that we are just fulfilling our principles until we are forced to take a historical approach in which to judge the character of the nation? Is there any answers to any of the questions that I posed today? It really all might be subjective, and honestly, I don't even think that I've found my own personal answer quite yet. Once again, history is always changing, and who knows what events may surface that might lead us to an answer. However, there are things that we can take away from today. I got to this question when I found that patriotism was declining in the United States. So what does the character of our nation mean for patriotism? Do we need an answer to be patriotic? I do think that we can be proud of the principles that we were founded upon, even if we haven't always lived up to them. And don't get me wrong, there are things in our history that we should be extremely proud of. However, I would like to make a distinction between American patriotism and American righteousness. We can be patriotic, but we don't always have to be on the side of our country when our nation is doing something that is morally reprehensible. We are allowed to say that as Americans, there are things in our history that we are absolutely ashamed of. And if those actions outweigh those principles, that's just up for interpretation. However, I also think that we should have the conversation of whether or not we even need to be patriotic. This doesn't mean being hostile toward our nation, but this does mean setting aside support for the United States of America in order to support the world at large. I don't think that there's a correct answer on this topic. Once again, it's a personal thing. And the only person who can find a correct answer for you is you. Character is defined as the culmination of ideas and actions. They both determine character, but they often do contradict each other. Does a person who does bad things with good intentions, are they considered a martyr or a monster? How far do our ideas take us until what we do to others becomes more important? We may not get an answer, but this is a conversation that we need to start having as Americans. And I totally get it. With somebody calling in to question the moral goodness of someone or something that you love, you might feel hurt and stop at nothing to defend that emotion. But on the contrary, somebody justifying the actions of an entity that you believe to have hurt others or even yourself can be absolutely infuriating. And I can totally get why these two people may not think that they will ever be able to see eye to eye with each other. But this is a conversation that we need to start having as Americans in order to better understand our nation and even to better understand each other. Earlier, I brought up one of the goals that were stated in the preamble of the Constitution. And having this conversation might just be the key to forming that perfect union. Thank you.